So everybody, thank you for joining us. This is Barry Garron, who is well, most importantly, an alumnus of the political science department here at the University of Missouri, but also a journalism graduate of the University of Missouri, and spent a long time at the Kansas City Star, I think from 1971 till, what was the year that you left the Star?
I think I joined the Star in 73 and
73.
left in 97.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you went to the Hollywood Reporter, is that right?
I went to the Hollywood Reporter as the chief TV critic in 98 for about, well, until 2009.
Wow. And then have you been doing freelance work since
Mostly
then?
freelance since then, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a pretty impressive career. But what we're going to talk about today is your campaign button, your interest in campaign buttons and your campaign button collection. At least a large chunk. I'm not sure exactly how many you had altogether, but you have incredibly generously donated a large number of those buttons to the Truman School and that's what I'd like to talk to you about.
Sure, I think there's, I didn't count, but my guess is somewhere around 4,000 buttons in about 140 frames or so.
Yeah. So was that your whole collection that you donated? Or
no, it represents about a third of my collection, but I always consider it the backbone of my collection because it was something that I probably paid more attention to than all of the other subsets in my group. And also there are organizations, there's national organizations that focus on political items that you won't find on other types of political buttons. So it was sort of, like I say, the very nexus, the center of my collection.
So what, I guess my first question for you is what got you interested in starting to collect these? How long, what time period of collecting does this represent for you?
Well, the buttons represent it is very specific, actually. It consists entirely of presidential candidates from major parties. There are a few candidates who were tried and failed to be nominated, and a few third-party candidates, but I would say about 97% of them or so are the candidates that were nominated from the Democratic and the Republican parties. The button was invented in about 1894, so the first candidates to use them were in 1896. It was President McKinley, the Republican, and Bryan, the Democrat. And the collection goes from there up to and including 1996. It seemed like a century was a good time to stop. But the same thing happened with campaign buttons as happened to a lot of different things people collect, including baseball cards. For a long time, there were just a few sets, and you could keep track of just about everything that was issued then. And then there was this explosion that happened in the 1990s and 1980s, but especially 1990s. In which the number of campaign buttons just increased astronomically, and there was no real way at that point of putting together a collection that would represent most of the buttons that were issued. So it seemed like, again, a good time to consolidate, fill in blank spaces. And so I pretty much concentrated on that since then. As for what got me into it in the first place, I grew up in Chicago, and you don't have to be an alderman's son to be interested in politics in Chicago. When I was 10 years old, I went to the local Kennedy headquarters, and they were paying kids like me a quarter an hour to distribute literature in mailboxes in apartment buildings. and there were some buttons there, and I grabbed a few of them. I didn't really start collecting until maybe another 5 or 6 years when I started collecting anti-Vietnam War buttons. But that was sort of my first exposure to buttons, and then about 5 or 6 years later, I started in earnest.
Well, that's great. So did you grow up in the city of Chicago or
In the city? Yeah.
Okay. All right. So yeah, my mother and father are both. My dad grew up in Oak Park, and so I'm 52, almost 53. I was born when they were college students when I was born, so they're not that much older than I. But my guess is that my dad was born in 1947, and he lived in Oak Park, grew up in Oak Park, and my mom grew up in Palatine. So kind of opposite ends of the suburban world of Chicago. But anyway, I was going to ask you if you were from Chicago, because you have a little bit of a Chicago accent. I was detecting. I thought I was anyway.
Yep. After all these years.
Indeed. Okay, so do you have a favorite button?
I have a favorite candidate or two, and so I'm sort of enamored with the buttons that came from their campaigns. Harry Truman would probably be at the top of my list, and obviously there's the Missouri connection and everything, but his campaigns were very interesting, and there isn't a lot of material because they were never well funded. There was only one. I mean, he became president just months after his inauguration as vice president when FDR died, and he only had the actual campaign in 1948. It wasn't well funded. People did not expect him to win, so why give a lot of money to somebody that you didn't really hope that you didn't think had much of a chance? But his issues came out were loud and clear in his buttons. His passion for civil rights, especially, but the fact that he was just known as being a plain-spoken person of the people. So he's one of my certainly one of my favorites, and I sort of gravitated toward his buttons. Also Kennedy's, because history may not regard him as maybe one of the most influential presidents, but he had a great impact at his time and his day, and he was very influential, and he took a new generation of Americans, and he sort of pointed them in the direction of public service. And I got swept up in that a little to some extent.
So there's just the one frame of Truman button. There was one in there that intrigued me that I had to look up, and that was the 8-ball button.
Ah, yes. Well, there's nothing obvious about a button that looks like a black 8-ball from a pool game.
Yeah.
But it meant something to his followers, which was that he was behind the 8-ball. The saying goes, he was, people didn't give him much of a chance. People were predicting in some ways on the basis of poor polling techniques that he was sure to lose. So wearing the 8-ball was understood, at least among a lot of people, to mean I'm for Truman and we're really behind here and we got to hustle.
Yeah, that election is amazing. That he managed to pull that out is really amazing. You know, when there's a president with a splinter party taking vote away, but he had two, right? He had Henry Wallace on the left, and he had
Thurman and Wallace, yeah.
Thurman on the right, and it was it's just an amazing. It's like I now work at a place called the Truman School since the poli-sci department has moved with Truman, but Truman is one of my favorites as well. It's hard to not get very interested in Harry Truman's story, I think. So
yeah, you know, I did not minor in history, but when you collect political buttons your entire life, you I think in many cases get an education that's equivalent to a history minor.
So in your career as a journalist, you did primarily TV, as a TV critic and entertainment reporting. Did you ever get the chance to do political reporting? Did you ever have an interest in doing political reporting?
I did, and that's in fact why I as a student, I earned both a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science and a Bachelor of Journalism, because my thinking was at the time that I would be a political reporter. And I worked initially for some smaller papers. I worked for the Columbia Tribune right after graduation, and then a paper in upstate New York that doesn't exist anymore. And I did some political reporting for them. But on smaller papers, you usually have several beats, and one of the beats I had was covering education. So when I moved to the Kansas City Star, I was hired as an education writer, particularly higher education, and did that for quite a while. Did some. We started a consumer action column, which I was the initial editor of for a few years. And then really out of pure happenstance, there was an opening for a TV critic, then TV radio critic position. I had my doubts about that, but I was eager to see some other aspects of journalism. And as soon as I started doing that, I knew that that was the thing for me. For one thing, politics and current events play a big role if you're doing your job right as reporting on television. So you do get to combine a lot of different areas that way, and it was quite a ride.
So I think you actually kind of answered this, or I'm guessing what the answer is, but I'd like to ask. By far the biggest part of the collection that you donated is Clinton buttons, right? There's 26 frames of Clinton buttons and then a couple of frames of anti-Clinton buttons. Why so many Clinton buttons?
Because I guess that was the candidate that taught me the lesson I referred to earlier, which is you can try, but they've expanded so much now that even a good faith effort will never get you a significant portion of all the buttons that were issued on behalf of that candidate. I thought Clinton at the time, coming when he did, represented an interesting candidate and a good president. And so I was intrigued by the man, but what I found as I got into the 1980s and then the 1990s was that you've got to stop somewhere. And there are a lot of colleagues of mine who collect buttons of one type or another, and they started out and they said, I've got these two candidates and that's all I'm going to collect. And they built very powerful collections based on just these two. I was always more of a generalist. I always took I always felt that there was never a button I couldn't love. And so I would begin collecting a lot of everything, and in some ways that was a good way to go, and so in other ways it meant always never being able to focus and build, except in one area. There's one subject matter that I think have a collection that is perhaps of national strength. And that's a collection of buttons from the Chicago World's Fair of 1933, 1934. I was not around then, but my father was a teenager and went there. And growing up in Chicago, I was always intrigued by that fair. And you know, I have other souvenirs from it, but I assembled virtually every button I could and could have heard of from there, a couple frames worth. And you asked what button is favorite of mine. There's I've never seen anyone like it. There's one that was issued by a Brooklyn Grotto restaurant club that took a tour to the Chicago World's Fair and came up with this button with a hanging bell attached to it. I've never seen anything like it, and it gets its own little frame. Wow,
That's fantastic. Yeah, no, so my, yeah, I mean, my entire family is from Chicago. We moved, my childhood was spent moving around the country. We moved every couple of years, but my grandparents also attended the fair as teenagers. So I've heard lots of Chicago World's Fair stories from them, but they didn't save any cool souvenirs, so or collect any buttons, I must say.
There's a ton of souvenirs out there from the Chicago World's Fair. Some of them made in such great quantities that they're very inexpensive. They must have made millions and millions of this one particular button that says I was there, that can easily be bought today, almost 100 years later, for like $2 or $3. That's how many they made of these things. But then, of course, there are the more unusual buttons, and the Buck Rogers button at the World Fair, or the Bring 'Em Back Alive button from Frank Buck's traveling wild animal show at the Chicago World Fair, that were not issued in those quantities. But it's like political buttons. A lot of their value depends on how many were produced and what the demand is for them.
Yeah, that's very cool. But back to the collection. So,
okay.
So I was intrigued by the large number of Wendell Wilkie buttons. Is there something about Wendell Wilkie that you found particularly?
Well, most of the Wendell Wilkie buttons that I have, if I recall correctly, took the form of sort of anti-FDR buttons. There were two frames of buttons, and they were what we call word buttons. They didn't show pictures of candidates, or just words, and they were arguments for not electing FDR to a third term. One was simply because no president had ever served a third term. And the Republicans went around saying, like, this is going to be the start of an empire, and, you know, Washington wouldn't, but here's FDR. And others pointed out that his children were automatically enlisted in the military as officers, and implied that they got special privileges because they were the children of the president. There was really a lot of clever buttons. They mostly came in two sizes. I probably have about 3/4 or so of those type that were issued, because whenever I would see one, I would immediately see if it was one I had, and if it wasn't, I would do everything I could to add it to my collection, kind of a special subset. It wasn't so much Wilkie. I mean, he was a decent man, a decent candidate, but it was the controversy of electing FDR to a third term, and that was intriguing. I have quite a few FDR buttons, all things considered, because there is material from all his campaigns. But nobody had such an array of anti-material as that particular election and that particular candidate.
So okay. So you mentioned just now that if it was one you didn't have, you would try to get it. So how, with that many buttons, and a lot of it collected before the convenience, say, of having an iPhone where you could just have pictures on your phone to look at and compare them. How did you do that? How did you manage the? I mean, where did you look for buttons? Where did you get them? Did you go to shows and stores, and how did you have? Did you just have them in your head, what you had and what you were looking for?
No, one of the good things about being a generalist was that if you see a button and it was beyond your ability to pay for it or beyond my ability to pay for it, no worries. There are other buttons out there I'm sure could fit in the collection. So there wasn't too many specific buttons that I would chase. When I started collecting, there was, of course, no internet. And people would add to their collection by going to button shows. They would go to garage sales. They would go to flea markets. There were dealers. They would often make photocopies of their inventory, and if you would send them $1 or $2, they would send you what they had, and you see if you had something that you wanted. These all continue to exist, but the internet changed everything in terms of the source for these things. Now, in addition to auctions, you can participate in one from anywhere in the country because of the internet. You can go on eBay, particularly, and I've added hundreds of buttons through eBay. And see what's being offered and bid on it or not as you see fit and as your budget allows. And so that's probably collectors have their own Facebook pages in terms of showing different material and inviting other people if they were interested to buy it and so forth. So it's changed a lot in terms of how you're able to find things. But there's no substitute for the thrill of going into a flea market, seeing a button that nobody really realized what it meant or who it was, yeah, and saying, wow, this is a find.
So you just answered the question I was about to ask, which is it less fun? Has the internet made it less fun?
It's great to see what's out there. It can be nail biting as the bids go down to the last minute. But the greatest fun of all is just walking in on something from a garage sale or a flea market or an antique store. Antique stores are also good sources. And coming away with something you never expected to find.
So do you have a favorite find that way? Like
I found something that was there were in the early 1900s, there was a comic book character called the Yellow Kid.
Yep.
And they put out a whole set of buttons with the Yellow Kid buttons. And I happened to come across 4 of them that were unusually well priced, and I bought them. I'm not sure exactly how it developed, but somebody said, I'm interested in probably some newspaper, political or button collecting paper in Yellow Kid buttons. And I said, well, I don't have that much. I have just a few that I got, and so I ended up trading one for a Harding that I probably would never have been able to purchase without making that trade. I had a friend of mine, this goes back another 30, 40 years ago, who collected comic books, but got tired of it and gave me his collection. The thing about comic books is that they need to be preserved. You need to put them in acid-free paper. They can yellow. Buttons are a lot more durable. If you keep them at a decent temperature and away from sunlight, they can last a long, long time without showing signs of decay. So I happened in a mall, I happened to come across a dealer in both buttons and comic books. So his collection got traded for a whole lot of buttons. So things happen like that. You never know.
That's great. That's great. So do you collect anything else besides buttons?
Not really. It's mostly all buttons, and as I say, a few odd souvenirs from the World's Fair. But even then, my great interest is buttons from the World's Fair. So yeah, buttons sort of took over. I mean, when I was a kid, I collected everything. I collected rocks and shells and bottle caps and anything you can think of. But eventually, you know, your interest focused on one thing or another. And in my case, it was buttons.
So you've got a pretty good collection of Carter and Ford buttons. I was wondering if you covered the 76 Republican Convention at all when it was in Kansas City.
I did get some buttons from the convention from some of my friends who did cover it, but mostly at that time I was not a TV critic. I had my different beat that I did, and so I didn't really get to be too involved in the actual coverage of the 76 convention, Republican convention. But there were some memorable buttons that came out of that. It was a heavily contested election primary between Reagan and Ford, and there were a series of buttons in different sizes that were essentially the same button, but one showed Ford with a black hat and Reagan with a white hat, and the other showed Reagan with a black hat and Ford with the white hat. And hope I didn't get that messed up. But there were quite a few. There were some debate buttons which I included from some of the debates that took place during the campaign as well.
Well, that campaign is just that whole 1976 campaign is such a significant campaign. It was really the kind of changed campaigning, and so I've always found that a very interesting campaign. So of the buttons that you've got, I'd be interested to know if you got the chance to, any of those candidates that you interviewed in your course of your career as a journalist.
There were times as a television writer and a member of the Television Critics Association that there would be documentaries or of one sort or another that focused on the presidency. And when that happened, the Television Critics Association met twice a year and it still does in Los Angeles, except for the time now taken off for the pandemic. But I can remember Carter and I can remember Ford attending and answering questions about some of the documentaries, mostly on PBS, about their administrations. And so I got to sort of see them firsthand in that way, but not, not so much just to chat with them.
Yeah. Well, so you were the president of the Television Critics Association, correct?
I was from, let's see, it was 1991 to 1993.
So what is, first of all, I mean, you run for election of that, I assume?
Yeah, but I didn't put out any buttons.
You didn't put it. But I am curious about that. What kinds of things does the Television Critics Association do?
Well, basically, the Television Critics Association works in partnership with the networks to present this a critics press tour, which I mean initially ran perhaps for a little over a week, but now, given all the sources of broadcasting and streaming, lasts for considerably more than that. It goes down to framing the rules that we operate in terms of what questions are, and not what questions can't be asked, because anything can be asked, but for instance, you can't take advantage of your position ethically to try and sell a script or something. It negotiates with hotels for the best rates for the association meetings. It serves as a clearinghouse for information among television critics. It's taken on quite a number of different responsibilities over the years, but it's very vital to if you're a television critic or a television writer, you would miss a lot by not being a member. And in the same way, when I first joined, most of the members were from large metropolitan newspapers. Today, that group constitutes only a very tiny percentage. A lot of it are people who represent websites that cover the industry, magazines, freelancers. People would come usually to these press tours from all over the country. Now, most people seem to attend from Los Angeles, in part because there isn't the travel budgets that there used to be. So everything evolves. I mean, when I first joined, there was no Fox, there was no cable, there was no streaming. There was the three major commercial networks and PBS. And then all this time, there's been all these changes. It's been remarkable.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's all right. So you mentioned sort of an explosion in the amount of buttons being put out. Do you think, I'd like your perception on this. Do you think that is mostly, is that trying to capitalize on a collector's market, or do you think the campaigns are really find the button to be an effective campaign communication device in this day and age?
I think that the vast majority are what we call vendor buttons. They're put out specifically for sale by private individuals, as opposed to the earlier days when most of the buttons were put out by the campaigns themselves. It doesn't diminish from the value or the authenticity of the button if it's a vendor button, so long as it's not what is referred to as a fantasy button, or which are buttons that are made years after the event that look like the buttons of that time. Those are not authentic buttons.
Yeah.
There is a federal law that requires that buttons that purport to be or seem to be from a different time, but were issued later, be marked in some ways, usually around the side or the inside with the date that they were actually put out. but not everybody who does this follows the rules. So you have to be, there are books written about what are called brummagans. Brummagans are essentially fake buttons designed to fool people into thinking that they came out when the campaign was full swing.
Yeah. So actually that leads me to a question, and I won't keep you all day, I promise. But in the George W. Bush, in one of your George W. Bush frames, actually, you've got, I don't know, like maybe a dozen different Bush and then different possible vice presidential running mate buttons. Who produced those buttons?
Well, those were more than likely produced by vendors for sale at the conventions.
Okay.
You know, candidates, it's very rare these days, almost, I guess, unheard of, that you go into a convention that is brokered. You know, going in who the nominee is going to be.
Yeah.
But a lot of times you don't know who the vice president is or will be. And so a lot of vendors will produce buttons urging to be purchased by the followers of the various people, urging that their man or woman be the nominee for vice president.
All right. So let me see. I have just a couple more for you, and then I'll let you go. I promise.
Sure.
Hold on a second here. Oh dear. All right. Well, so you've got, between the two campaigns, or three campaigns, 60 and 68, 72, you got a fair number of Richard Nixon buttons there. And I guess I would, I'd like to ask, you know, if there's a particular button that stands out for you in those two campaigns, and if you just have any general thoughts or impressions of Nixon and his long time on the, actually you've got Nixon buttons from 52 to 60 as well, really, because you've got Eisenhower buttons.
Right. And there are collectors who, when somebody is elected president, they reach back earlier into their career and get their local buttons, because invariably they held state or local offices before that.
Yeah.
I haven't done that, so in that sense, I've limited myself a bit. I don't know that there's a Nixon button per se that I like. I like the frame that I assembled of Watergate buttons. This was a huge controversy at its time, and a great chance for those of us who always suspected that Nixon was kind of up to no good, to be able to say "I told you so" to everybody else. Yeah, I think there is one button, and I can't remember. I'm pretty sure it's a button, not a headline, that had to do with the firing of Archibald Cox as Attorney General prosecuting the Watergate matter, and the button he was intended at Nixon and said, "Impeach the cocksacker."
Is that in there?
I believe it is.
Oh, I've got to go look for it. So, one of the other candidates that you have a lot of buttons in the collection is Carter. I think there's 9 frames of Carter buttons, and so I'm curious to know, you know, is that just a function of Well, I'll let you answer.
Supply
Why
and
so many
demand.
carbon buttons?
Yeah, supply and demand.
Okay.
Again, the 70s, the 70s were not only a time when button sales grew exponentially, mostly abetted by the vendors who printed these buttons and sold them to people. But other types of collections, and here again I refer to baseball cards and other sorts of sports memorabilia. Also just skyrocketed in terms of the number of things that are available. And I think it pretty much, started in the 70s. We were getting some inkling of where things were headed. And then in the 80s and 90s, things really took off. If you were to try, for example, to put together a pretty comprehensive Barack Obama collection of buttons, you could dedicate years and just focus just on that one thing, because there's so much material out there. So it's largely a function of the availability. I was probably starting to be in a better position to actually afford to buy this stuff.
Sure.
As a college student and as a newly minted reporter and a young family, that there wasn't a lot of discretionary income for buttons, but that started to grow a little bit over time. It's not a bad thing, really, to not be able to afford everything, because when you do get something you like, you really like it. You treasure it more, I think, if it's something you don't really expect to come by, but you do.
Yeah, I understand that completely. So another candidate that you've got a fairly large number of buttons for is Barry Goldwater. And particularly, you have some big ones. There's quite a few big, large-sized buttons of Barry Goldwater. And I guess I'd be interested to know your impression of Goldwater as a candidate, and if there's a particular standout among his buttons. I've got a favorite I was looking at in your collection, but I'd be curious to know if you have one of your Goldwater buttons.
Well, there are some Goldwater buttons I liked. There's one that has kind of a bubble on top of it. It's unusual because buttons are usually flat, but this one had a bubble which contained a little bit of water and some fake gold, and so it was obviously a reference to Goldwater, rhombus or rebus or whatever it is. I should know. But the thing about the 9-inch buttons, I never really pursued them a lot because you can't really get more than one in a frame. So sometimes if you have a collector who specializes in one particular candidate, they may get some of these 9-inch buttons and then build the frame around smaller buttons around it, which works for them, but didn't work as well for me. So I'm not exactly sure how you're going to handle those, but good luck to you on that.
Okay. Thank you.
In Arizona, as you know, he enjoys a very high reputation. In the country at large, he was a rather polarizing figure. His opposition to civil rights and the belief sort of perpetuated by the Democrats that he can't be trusted to keep his finger on the nuclear code, and I think hurt him nationally. But in Arizona, he remains a sort of a semi-god.
Yeah. Well, the button that's my favorite in those Goldwater buttons that you've got there is it's one, and it's got a heart, and then it uses that campaign slogan that he had, "In your heart, you know he's right."
Right. And one of the most famous anti-Goldwater buttons, and a reasonably valuable one, is one an anti-Goldwater button that says, "In your guts, you know he's nuts."
That's good. I like that.
I had considered for quite some time what I ought to be doing with this collection, and what the best use for it was. A lot of people, when they reach a certain age, they sell off their collections, but I just thought that it had and would have some value educationally, informationally, even from an entertainment standpoint. And I'm so delighted that I was able to find this kind of great home for it, and that you ride herd over it.
Well, it is a spectacular collection, and we will do right by it. I promise you. I can tell you, I had so I have two daughters. My one daughter is going to be a senior here at Mizzou. She's off for the summer. I think I told you in the email. She's a camp counselor in Michigan at a music camp this summer. But my younger daughter, who's heading off to college in the fall, was babysitting a girl who's about 9 or 10 today, and they happened to come by, and I said, "Come on!" And I had been looking at the buttons because in anticipation of our talk, and I took them in there, and they were both quite fascinated by them and had lots of questions, and we had quite a discussion. So I do think they're an excellent sort of educational opportunity, and they're cool to look at, and I have no doubt that our students are going to find them quite interesting. So
that's wonderful.
I will keep you apprised of all of those efforts, and I can tell you that we're all very grateful to you for making this gift to the department. So,
my great pleasure.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, my pleasure.
It was nice to meet you, if only on Zoom.
Okay. All right. Take care.
All right. Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.